I've said that some people will tell you that the purpose of life is to be happy, and those people are idiots. And it was a bit of a rough statement, but what I meant by that, it was actually inspired by a statement by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the great critic of the Soviet prison system. And he commented that happiness is something that's done in by the first harsh blow that reality deals you. And I believe this to be the case. There are many circumstances in life where happiness is not only the wrong response, but also where the expectation of happiness as a response will put you, the person attempting to be happy, in absolutely the wrong psychological state to be prepared for what must be done. People are built, so to speak, to experience a very wide range of motivational and emotional states that only bear a tenuous relationship to one another. And the reason for that is that the environment that human beings inhabit is so complex that our adaptation depends on a variety of very finely differentiated responses. Now, one of the things the existentialists would say is, what's the relationship between mental health and responsibility? And that's a good question, because it also has to do something with something like the definition of mental health and responsibility. It's like, if you want your life to be well constituted, let's say, whatever that means, and it doesn't mean being happy. See, the reason it can't mean being happy is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to be called on to act when you're not happy. So, for example, when one of your parents dies, you're going to make a choice. You're not going to be happy. That will not be, well, hopefully you won't be. Otherwise you're tangled in some sort of Freudian nightmare, but let's assume that that's not the case. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be hurt, and maybe even partly broken. So what the hell are you supposed to do then? Well, the answer is, you should be more use than trouble under such circumstances. That's a good thing to strive for, because your mother's going to be, if it's your father, your mother's going to be equally distraught, and so are your siblings, and everyone else you care for. Maybe by that time you should be tough enough so that in that situation, you're good for something. Someone has to make the damn funeral arrangements. Someone has to settle out the will. Someone has to make sure the family doesn't degenerate into horrific squabbling, which is something that often happens after the death of a parent. And you're not going to be motivated to do that by happiness. And what if you have a sick child when you're a parent? Maybe it's a chronic illness. You are not going to be happy about that. It'll be a weight that you carry with you all the time. And it's one of those things that seems particularly unjust. It's like, okay, well, you're no longer happy. Well, if being happy is the purpose of life, well, then you're basically, that's pretty much it for you, isn't it? And these catastrophes that I'm speaking of, you can be certain that you're going to be exposed to many of those during your life. It'll be a rare period. I think it's a rare period in anyone's life where one or more of such things isn't going on chronically. If it's not you with some terrible health problem or some other terrible problem, then it's a parent or a sibling or a child, or because you're connected to other people and they're vulnerable too. So that's the lot of human beings. And so if it's happiness, and this is what Solzhenitsyn said about happiness too, it said, happiness is a philosophy who's brought to ruin by the first blow of a guard's truncheon. It's like, yeah, that's about as bluntly as you can put it.
I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. Like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it, and every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done, and it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio, and I would presume, a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. Sure. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. You know, 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work. So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. You know, well, why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, you know? And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And like, I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, you know, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. You know, and a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that. So happiness is a side effect. It's not a thing in itself. It's something that comes upon you. We're subject to forces within us that aren't of our voluntary control. And certainly happiness is one of those, because you cannot will yourself to be happy. You might be able to will yourself to be unhappy, but you can't will yourself to be happy. There are certain preconditions that have to be met that are quite mysterious in order for you to be happy, and then it happens. And then maybe, if you're wise, you regard that as a minor incomprehensible miracle, that somehow you happen to be in the right place at the right time. Now, I've made the case that the most effective means of pursuing the good life, which is not the same as pursuing happiness, is to adopt something like a stance of maximal responsibility towards the suffering and malevolence in the world. And I think that should be pursued primarily as an individual responsibility. It's not like I don't think that political and familial larger organizations are necessary, but in the final analysis, we each suffer alone in some fundamental sense, and we have our own malevolence to contend with in some fundamental sense, and the proper beginning of moral behavior, which is the proper beginning of the right way to act in the world, is to take responsibility for that. I think you do what you can to conceptualize the highest good that you can conceptualize. That's the first thing, to develop a vision of what might be. And it has to be a personalized vision as well as a universalized vision. And then you work diligently to ensure that your actions are in keeping with that. And you allow yourself on that pursuit to be informed by the knowledge of your ignorance and the necessity for acting and speaking in truth. And a fair bit of that, I believe, is derived, I think it's fair to say that that's derived from an underlying Judeo-Christian ethic, and I make no bones about the fact that I think of those stories metaphysically or philosophically or psychologically as fundamental to the proper functioning of our society insofar as it can function properly. And so it's not happiness, it's meaning. And meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And then I'll close with this. Responsibility is not only to do what you believe to be right. That's not, because that's duty. That's not enough. That's sort of what the conservatives put forward as the ultimate virtue, which is duty. It's not that. It's that you're acting in a manner that is in accordance with what you believe to be right, but you're doing it in a manner that simultaneously expands your ability to do it, which means that you cannot stay safely ensconced within the confines of your current ethical beliefs. You have to stand on the edge of what you know and encounter continually the consequences of your ignorance to expand your domain of knowledge and ability, so that you're not only acting in an efficient manner, but you're increasing the efficiency and productivity and meaningfulness of what it is that you're engaged in. And I think that, and I believe that the psychological evidence supports this, even the neuropsychological evidence, is that that's when true happiness descends upon you. because it's an indication from the deepest recesses of your psyche, biologically instantiated, that you're in the right place at the right time. You're doing what you should be doing, but you're doing it in a manner that expands your capacity to do even better things in the future. And I think that's the deepest human instinct there is. It's not rational. It's far deeper than that. And it's something that's genuine and that exists within us and that constitutes a proper guide if you don't pervert it with self-deception and deceit.